Trotsky's theory of backwardness, an overview and evaluation. Trotsky's analysis of Russian society was meant to be linked directly, and was linked in his writings, to a theory of the Russian Revolution, specifically to what came to be known as, quote, the theory of the permanent revolution, end quote. The present study, in the following chapter, will attempt to show how, according to Trotsky, the one arises out of the other. But Trotsky's theory or conception of backwardness may also be judged on its own grounds, irrespective of the political or revolutionary theory derived from it, as a sociological generalization. Before evaluating Trotsky's theory of backwardness, however, it may be useful to draw together its various elements as these emerge in the exposition, and summarize its main points of analysis and its conclusions. What follows is presented in a manner more systematic than it appears in Trotsky's writings, but scrupulously attempts not to overstep the bounds of Trotsky's meaning. 1. Backwardness is a condition and a term which characterizes or describes two essentially different types of societies. The one is a static, even stagnant society whose internal mode of production and social structure remain what they have fundamentally always been and are incapable of generating change from within. This, roughly speaking, is the type of society called by Marx Oriental, or whose, quote, mode of production, end quote, Marx defined as Asiatic. The second type is a society which originally may have been of the first type, but which in the course of time and for various historical reasons has been subjected to the impact of other societies, defined as, quote, advanced or Western. In this case, change becomes a fundamental character of backwardness, and the interrelationship between this backward society and the advanced ones becomes crucial to an understanding of developments in the former particularly. Russia, for example, belongs to this second category of backwardness, and it is this category which is the subject of sociological and revolutionary as opposed to anthropological analysis. 2. The impact of an advanced society on a backward society may be said to be traumatic. Ultimately, the impact of an advanced society forces the backward society to adopt new forms of economic production. The advanced society undermines the traditional social hierarchy. It infects and transforms the existing elites. It introduces new patterns of thought, and throughout, it creates comparative norms. To a large extent, all this is true, even if the impact is the result of a, quote, colonial imperialist relationship. But the effect is far more extreme and more rapid where the impact precedes the colonial period, as in the case of Russia, and where the backward society has remained fundamentally independent. In that case, the very exigencies of the struggle for retaining independence lead to a more extensive adoption of new methods of economic and social organization, and thus to a more widespread disintegration of the traditional methods and forms of life. The process whereby this occurs may now be traced. 3. The confrontation between the backward and the advanced initially leads the former to seek to adopt, in part at least, those aspects of the latter which are the source of the latter's strength, since only in this way can the latter be withstood, i.e. on its own grounds. This involves primarily the copying of methods of economic production, but such copying cannot be effected without simultaneously copying or unleashing those social relations which these methods demand. This presents a dilemma to the political authority, the state, of the backward society, how to change methods of production without overly disturbing traditional social relations. The state meets the dilemma by pursuing the former while attempting to take greater control of the latter. Through bureaucratic interference, complete domination of the economy and especially capital formation, prevention of the growth of independent economic powers, and, finally, force and oppression. In fact, however, new social relations can never be completely suppressed or even controlled, and they develop in spite of the state's efforts. 4. In copying an advanced society, the backward society is working according to a ready-made model. This may suggest that it necessarily must reproduce both the paths followed by the advanced society in reaching that model as well as the actual model itself. In fact, of course, the advantage of a, quote, late comer is that, With hindsight and through the experience of the, quote, pioneer, the latecomer can move directly towards the end product, skipping various stages, avoiding the process of development, imposing upon itself the result of the process of development only. But this not only shortens the time span, it introduces, in fact, a different process and leads in the end to the creation of a different model, which subsumes that of the advanced society and goes beyond that of the advanced society. This is so because of the previously mentioned disruption of old social relations, the innovative nature of the new relations, and the peculiar intermixing of the whole. 5. The skipping of developmental stages creates curious results, for by leaping over forms of production, the backward society is also bypassing social forms. Those social groupings which would have come into being had there been no skipping over stages, i.e., had there been an adoption of earlier forms of production, do not come into being. On the other hand, such social groupings as constitute the preconditions of the latest model do crystallize. Simultaneously, the main elements of the traditional society remain. The old political authority, because of the power it has accumulated and its control over the economy, and the old agricultural sector, because its breakup need be only partial and limited in order to make the new sector viable for immediate purposes. Thus, as in the case of Russia, the overall curious result is political absolutism, aristocratic privileges, and a large agricultural population, together with advanced industry, urbanization, a working class, but no middle class. 6. This situation is characteristic of the unique process through which the backward society has traveled, namely, quote, uneven and combined development, end quote. The situation may be broken down into the following attributes. A. Backwardness, far from being total, is only partial, and in some ways the backward society is as advanced as any other. B. Conversely, sectors of the society have not changed at all, ostensibly at least, so that the overall impact is that of lopsidedness, uneven distribution of new forms of production, the polarization of society into various groups not directly or logically related to one another. C. The juxtaposition of very old and very new creates stark anomalies in a general non-rationalized economy and social structure, i.e. one that is in many ways counterproductive or self-defeating. D. The coexistence within one social framework of two fundamentally different and contradictory, quote, models of society arouses comparison, awareness of alternatives, and eventually a consciousness of backwardness, i.e. a consciousness of the fact that society is, in comparison with others, in some important sense, defective. E. New methods of production create new goals and aspirations, which are at variance with previous ones, but since the former have not been wholly adopted and the latter not wholly abandoned, there is both confusion over goals and a clash between goals. F. The contradictions inherent in uneven, non-uniform development, the growth of a consciousness of backwardness and of alternatives, the conflict over goals, all these create disharmony, instability, and a political situation which is potentially explosive. 7. The sociological and historical analysis of backwardness stops where political analysis begins. The sociological and historical analysis of backwardness has shown that backwardness of the type described above is a source of change resulting in serious social problems. The political analysis which will follow will show that these problems can be resolved only by revolution, and that this revolution will have a peculiar character arising directly from the peculiar character of this backwardness. The, quote, revolution of backwardness, end quote, thus forms a separate, though related subject. Alexander Gerschenkron, the historian of economic development, has written, quote, A good deal of our thinking about industrialization of backward countries is dominated, consciously or unconsciously, by the grand Marxian generalization according to which it is the history of advanced or established industrial countries which traces out the road of development for the more backward countries. There is little doubt that in some broad sense this generalization has validity. But one should be aware of accepting such a generalization too wholeheartedly, for the half-truth that it contains is likely to conceal the existence of the other half. That is to say, in several very important respects, the development of a backward country may, by the very virtue of that country's backwardness, tend to differ fundamentally from that of an advanced country. End quote. Gerschenkron. Wikipedia says Alexander Gerschenkron was an American economic historian and professor at Harvard University, trained in the German Historical School of Economics, born into a Jewish family in Odessa, then part of the Russian Empire, now in Ukraine. Gerschenkron fled the country during the Russian Civil War in 1920 to Austria, where Gerschenkron attended the University of Vienna, earning a doctorate in 1928. After the Anschluss in 1938, Gerschenkron emigrated to the United States. Back to the text. Footnote. The following is a very selected list of works on backwardness or underdevelopment which deal directly with the kinds of issues raised by Trotsky's writings on this subject, though hardly any seem to be aware of Trotsky's contribution to this field. And you know what? I'm going to look all these up, so you're going to have to live with it too. Okay, the first is Willard A. Belling and George O. Totten's edited volume, Developing Nations, Quest for a Model, published in 1970, which I'm not finding anything for. The contributions in that volume are Reinhard Bendix, What is Modernization, and Alberto Guerrero Ramos, Modernization Towards a Possibility Model. Otto Feinstein's edited volume, Two Worlds of Change, Readings in Economic Development. I don't see anything for this Otto Feinstein book. Otto Feinstein's edited volume, Two Worlds of Change, Readings in Economic Development, particularly the contributions by Simon Kuznets, Underdeveloped Countries and the Pre-Industrial Phase in the Advanced Countries, and Paul A. Barron, On the Political Economy of Backwardness. See Bert F. Hoselitz's edited volume, The Progress of Underdeveloped Areas. Harvey Lebenstein, Economic Backwardness and Economic Growth. W. W. Rostow, The Stages of Economic Growth, published in 1971. For the historical background to economic developments in the 20th century, see Karl Polanyi, The Great Transformation. Two examples of works written from a Marxist point of view are Paul A. Barron, The Political Economy of Growth, and David Horowitz, Imperialism and Revolution. The latter work adopts many of Trotsky's views. For a concise summary of Russia's unique features of development, see Boris Brutskas' article, Historical Peculiarities of the Social and Economic Development of Russia, in Reinhard Bendix and S.M. Lipset's Class Status and Power, published in 1953. Okay, so let me look up some of these books. So the Bert F. Hoselitz book, published in 1966, the description says, collection of articles on historical and sociological aspects of economic growth and the impact thereof on developing countries, covers political aspects, the impact of migration, private enterprise, cultural factors, the appeal of communist ideologies in developing countries, the role of the USA in respect to economic aid and technical cooperation, the effects of industrialization on trade, etc. I'm not seeing anything on Harvey Liebenstein's Economic Backwardness and Economic Growth, Studies in the Theory of Economic Development. Rostow's Stages of Growth. The Stages of Economic Growth by Rostow. One second. I'm trying to find a description of this book. I'm not really finding anything, but its subtitle is, which isn't stated in this book, A Non-Communist Manifesto. But Wikipedia has an entry for Rostow's Stages of Growth, or Rostov. The Rostovian takeoff model, also called Rostov's Stages of Growth, is one of the major historical models of economic growth. The Rostovian takeoff model was developed by W. W. Rostov. The model postulates that economic modernization occurs in 5 basic stages of varying length: traditional society, preconditions for takeoff, drive to maturity, age of high mass consumption. Rostov asserts that countries go through each of these stages fairly linearly, and set out a number of conditions that were likely to occur in investment, consumption, and social trends at each state. Not all of the conditions were certain to occur at each stage, however, and the stages and transition periods may occur at varying lengths from country to country and even from region to region. Rostov's model is one of the more structuralist models of economic growth, particularly in comparison with the, quote, backwardness model developed by Alexander Gerschenkron. The two models are not necessarily mutually exclusive, however, and many countries seem to follow both models rather adequately. Beyond the structured picture of growth itself, another important part of the model is the economic takeoff must initially be led by a few individual sectors. This belief echoes David Ricardo's comparative advantage thesis and criticizes Marxist revolutionaries' push for economic self-reliance in that it pushes for the quote initial development of only one or two sectors over the development of all sectors equally. This became one of the important concepts in the theory of modernization in social evolutionism. I want to look real quick at these because both of these people have been mentioned. There's descriptions actually. There's the page for the Wikipedia page for Backwardness. It actually talks about Gerschenkron and Thorstein Veblen's approach to backwardness. So these are actually really relevant to what we're reading here. So I'm going to look that up. Backwardness is a lack of progress by a person or group to some perceived cultural norm of advancement, such as, for example, traditional societies relative to modern scientific and technologically advanced industrial societies. Gerschenkron's model. The backwardness model is a theory of economic growth created by Alexander Gerschenkron. The model postulates that the more backward an economy is at the outset of economic development, the more likely certain conditions are to occur. 1. And it's a series of bullet points. Bullet. Special institutions, including banks or the state, will be necessary to properly channel physical capital and human capital to industries. Bullet. There will be an emphasis on the production of producer goods rather than consumer goods. Bullet. There will be an emphasis on capital-intensive production rather than labor-intensive production. Bullet. There will be a great scale of production and enterprise. Bullet. There will be a reliance on borrowed rather than local technologies. Bullet. The role of the agricultural sector as a market for new industries will be small. Bullet. There will be a reliance on productivity growth. End of bullets. The backwardness model is often contrasted with the Rostovian takeoff model developed by W. W. Rostov, which presents a more linear and structuralist model of economic growth, planning it out in defined stages. The two models are not mutually exclusive, however, and many countries appear to follow both models rather adequately. Veblen. Sorry, I was pronouncing his name wrong. Thorstein Veblen's 1915 Imperial Germany and the Industrial Revolution is an extended essay comparing the United Kingdom and Germany and concluding that the slowing growth of Britain and the rapid advances in Germany were due to the, quote, penalty of taking the lead. British industry worked out in a context of small competing firms the best ways to produce efficiently. Germany's backwardness gave Germany's gave Germany an advantage in that the best practice could be adopted in large-scale firms. All right, so and the Wikipedia for The Great Transformation by Karl Polanyi says, The Great Transformation is a book by Karl Polanyi, a Hungarian political economist, first published in 1944 by Farrar and Reinhardt. The Great Transformation deals with the social and political upheavals that took place in England during the rise of the market economy. Polanyi contends that the modern market economy and the modern nation-state should be understood not as discrete elements, but as a single human invention which he calls the, quote, market society. A distinguishing characteristic of the, quote, market society is that humanity's economic mentalities have been changed. Prior to market society, people based their economies on reciprocity and redistribution across personal and communal relationships. As a consequence of industrialization and increasing state influence, competitive markets were created that undermined these previous social tendencies, replacing them with formal institutions that aimed to promote a self-regulating market economy. The expansion of capitalist institutions within an economically liberal an economically liberal mindset, not only changed laws but also fundamentally altered humankind's economic relations. Prior to this, markets played a very minor role in human affairs and were not even capable of setting prices because of their diminutive size. It was only after industrialization and the onset of greater state control over newly created market institutions that the myth of human nature's propensity towards rational free trade became widespread. However, Polanyi asserts instead that, quote, man's economy as a rule is submerged in his social relationships, end quote, and Polanyi therefore proposes an alternative ethnographic economic approach called, quote, substantivism, in opposition to, quote, formalism, both terms coined by Polanyi in future work. On a broader theoretical level, the Great Transformation argues that markets cannot solely be understood through economic theory. Rather, markets are embedded in social and political logics, which make it necessary for economic analysts to take into account politics when trying to understand the economy. For this reason, the Great Transformation is a key work in the fields of political economy and international political economy. And the description for the political economy of growth by Paul A. Barron says, one of the most influential studies ever written in the field of development economics, the political economy of growth, has, since first publication in 1957, bred a whole school of followers who are producing further works along the lines created by Barron. Concerned with the generation and use of economic surplus, the political economy of growth analyzes from this point of view both the advanced and underdeveloped countries, a work in political economy rather than solely in economics. The political economy of growth treats the economic transformation of society as one facet of a total social and political evolution. And some of the quotes for it say, I think there are a few works of recent Marxist economics from which students can learn so well. Eric Hobsbawm. I believe it is not necessary to give evidence of the admiration I felt for Campagnard Barron, as well as for his work on underdevelopment, which was so constructive in our present and still weak state of economic knowledge. Ernesto Che Guevara. This kind of scholarship and intelligence demands courage. Herbert Marcuse. And the little bio says, Paul A. Barron lived from 1909 to 1964 and was professor of economics at Stanford University. Born in the Ukraine, Barron was educated in Germany and the Soviet Union and moved to the United States on the eve of the Second World War. After wartime military service, Barron joined the staff of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, leaving to become a member of the Stanford economics faculty in 1949. Barron was a frequent contributor to Monthly Review, co-author with Paul M. Sweezy of Monopoly Capital, and author of The Political Economy of Growth and The Longer View. Not really seeing anything for David Horowitz's Imperialism and Revolution. Second. It looks like the class status and power, social stratification and comparative perspective by Reinhard Bendix and Seymour Martin Lipset. I actually have a piece by Seymour Martin Lipset on this channel. Says, international study of social structure consisting of 6 groups of articles by various authors. 1. Social theories of class structure. 2. Historical comparisons. 3. Power and social status relations. 4. Differential class behavior, family, religion, political behavior, education, etc. 5. Social change. 6. Pending issues. Reference mainly to the USA and the USSR, with some references to Africa, Taiwan, China, Japan, Australia, and Poland. All right, back to the text. End footnote. Also, yeah. This passage, though it was not intended as such, may be taken as a fair summation of Trotsky's views. Of course, Trotsky believed his conception of backwardness and change to be consistent with Marx, and, insofar as it concentrated on the initial issue of the impact of the West, through capitalism, upon Russia, on the impingement, that is, of, quote, universal, end quote, history, upon particular history, it was consistent with Marx's ideas, but in a more fundamental way, it should now be clear, it diverged from Marx, and certainly from Marx as he was understood by his Russian followers. For the conclusions Trotsky reached were, firstly, that a backward society such as Russia need not, and in fact could not, develop that social structure and way of life which characterized the West, namely, capitalism, and, secondly, that the implication of this was not that Russia would avoid capitalism by withdrawing to some indigenous social form, but that she would bypass capitalism. At some point in the 1870s and the beginning of the 1880s, this possibility had crossed Marx's mind. But Marx remained skeptical and, in effect, did not really adopt this view, and certainly not in the context which Trotsky later raised it. It was basically at odds with Marx's European-centered perspective. Russian Marxists, in any case, may be said to have interpreted Marx as rejecting the notion of Russia's avoiding capitalism, and to have agreed with this rejection. That they considered the notion un-Marxist, if not anti-Marxist, was in no small measure responsible for the refusal, at least until 1917, when some changed their minds, to accept Trotsky's analysis. Footnote. Lenin's views of Russian capitalism were first defined in Lenin's The Development of Capitalism in Russia, published originally in 1899, which clearly saw capitalism in Russia to be inevitable. End footnote. Yet there is an important sense in which they were right and Trotsky wrong. The conception of backwardness as Trotsky presented the conception of backwardness was founded on the premise that, quote, history does not repeat itself, end quote. That historical analogies, though useful, are limited. That the past of one part of the world transforms the future of another. That, consequently, the task of social analysis was to clarify the unique, albeit in relation to universal factors. As such, Trotsky's conception constituted the only original effort to break out of the bounds of historically preconceived notions and to account for the refusal of the present to comply with these notions. More than others, Trotsky thus strove to use Marxism as a, quote, tool, not a conclusion. For this reason, Trotsky was less vulnerable to the charge of a mechanical historicism than others. But the analysis of the unique case which Trotsky studied, Russia, hinged on a correct reading of the actual scope of the changes to which the country had been subjected. Everything depended on how far Russia had in fact subsumed or assimilated the past and present of Western Europe, how far, therefore, she could put herself beyond that past and present. Trotsky did not stress changes at the expense of persisting elements. Both the new and the old constitute an integral part of Trotsky's view of Russia in particular, and of backwardness in general, But throughout his writings on this subject, there runs an ambiguity over the nature of the changes themselves. This ambiguity arose out of a failure to distinguish sufficiently between two related but far from interchangeable concepts, industrialization and modernization. Footnote: as technical terms, industrialization and modernization, and particularly modernization, are of course a product of modern social science. Although Trotsky speaks of, quote, modernizing, the term modernization itself does not as such appear in Trotsky's writings. But the concept is clearly implied throughout, and Trotsky is fully aware of its meaning. End footnote. Although Trotsky was clearly aware of the distinction between industrialization and modernization, Trotsky often ignored the distinction between industrialization and modernization, with the result that at certain crucial points, Trotsky's analysis of backwardness verged on questionable assumptions, without exhausting the possibilities of exact definition. The general properties distinguishing these two concepts may be described as follows. Footnote: these descriptions are historical, not, quote, eternal, i.e., their content may change in the future, but this is the meaning they have had in the past and present. Moreover, the actual properties may vary greatly in number and extent from country to country. They should be taken as, in a sense, more ideal than real. The literature on modernization is vast, but two summary accounts may be mentioned. C.E. Black's The Dynamics of Modernization, A Study in Comparative History, and S.N. Eisenstadt, Modernization, Protest and Change, published in 1966. I'm going to look these books up now. I'm not finding any description of the dynamics of modernization. This other one, Eisenstadt. Yeah, I don't see any description for modernization, protest, and change either. So, back to the text and footnote. So, I'm going to reread the last sentence. Without exhausting the possibilities of exact definition, the general properties distinguishing industrialization and modernization may be described as follows. Industrialization is that process whereby facilities for the production of industrial goods are created, and both concentration and dependence on industrial goods are replacing concentration and dependence on the production of agricultural goods. The process involves the following elements. A. The exploitation of natural resources and the development of transport facilities. B. The acquisition of scientific knowledge and technical skills. C. The concentration of labor, i.e. of a labor force, in central urban areas around places of work. D. Production for collective as opposed to personal consumption, i.e. not specifically for the individual's needs, but for the needs of society. Oh, yeah, shit. No, I do. Fuck. I'm sorry. Alright. I left my mom. They're here. Mom!
You left your what?
I left my bottle in the thing. Where are you going?
Dentist.
Oh, sorry. I left my thing in your car. Sorry. D. Universal school education, institutions of higher learning and encouragement of the growth of the latter and access to them. E. A technological communication network capable of reaching rapidly most, if not the whole, of the population. F. The formulation of national goals, widely enough accepted so that members of the society will be attracted towards them. G. capacities for the mobilization of human and natural resources in accordance with these goals. H. National, as opposed to only or primarily local or regional cultural forms and orientations. I. Some form of egalitarian ideology, at least in the sense of political equality. Footnote. The extent of this can vary greatly, from formal legal equality to the actual pursuit of economic equality, but even, quote, lip service to some concept of equality, e.g., quote, men are born inherently equal, end quote, insofar as it constitutes at least a formal aspect of national ideology, may be sufficient, end footnote. J. Social and economic mobility, i.e., possibilities of change and improvement. K. Political institutions based on some form of representation. Footnote. This too may vary greatly and does not imply actual democratic institutions, but rather some democratic ideology, e.g., popular sovereignty. End footnote. Sorry, I know that's disgusting. Looked at in this way, it is clear that although modernization involves industrialization, modernization is far from exhausted by industrialization. To put it another way, the process of industrialization may take place, may even be in large part completed, without leading to modernization, though it may force the partial adoption of some other aspect of modernization. Far more than change in economic production is necessary to bring about modernization, and unless one adopts a strictly deterministic Marxist viewpoint, there is no reason why a change in economic production should call into being all the essential properties of modernization. Perhaps it was the Marxist framework of his thought which caused Trotsky to confuse unquestionable signs of industrialization with the sufficient conditions of modernization. Whatever the case, Trotsky sometimes wrote as if modernization and industrialization were identical or nearly enough so. And you can kind of say this too about Bolshevism and maybe at least like Marxism coming out of the Second International as well. In the book Magnetic Mountain, about the Magnitogorsk city complex, the author Stephen Kotkin, I don't think he's not like a leftist or anything, I don't think, but in fact I'd say no, he's not. He says, if you have a steel plant in the Soviet Union, like if you had a steel plant, that was like civilization would automatically fall forth from it. And then he says, in fact, the existence of a steel plant was civilization itself, which is an interesting idea. Whatever the case, Trotsky sometimes wrote as if the two of modernization and industrialization were identical or nearly enough so. In fact, however, using such distinctions as outlined above, Trotsky should have drawn a more refined contrast between Russia and Western Europe, or between a backward society such as Russia and advanced societies such as England and France. In accordance with these distinctions, Russia was a society undergoing the process of industrialization, though even Russia undergoing the process of industrialization was only partly true, but hardly at all the process of modernization. It is undeniable that in some ways Russia had been modernized. There was a state administration concerned with economic planning. There were institutions of higher learning and an intellectual elite. There was some conception, though not on a mass level, of certain national goals, and there were perhaps some signs of the other aspects of the process of modernization. But, on the whole, not only were these elements limited, but others were almost completely absent. No universal education, no real national culture stronger than the roots of regionalism or of the nationalities. no widespread egalitarian ideology, no representative institutions, and so on. It is not even clear to what extent she could be defined as an industrialized society. As Trotsky himself recognized, industrialization was only partial and uneven, and dependence on agricultural production for the servicing of loans in effect increased instead of lessening. Moreover, it is not even possible to say that there was a clear trend towards modernization, although a move in the direction of modernization may be said to have occurred later, in the years prior to 1917. For the great mass of the people, in any case, those changes which had taken place did not mean involvement in a new modern world, although since Peter the Great, Russia had periodically revamped herself in response to outside pressures. The changes were either too limited or merely superficial or affecting only small segments of the society. Usually, the changes were followed by periods of reaction, and where the changes aimed at the masses as an emancipation, they proved to be half-hearted and unfulfilled. In fact, Russia may be taken to be a classic example, as Trotsky himself recognized, of a society in which economic and administrative change is pursued largely without reference to social and political institutions. In which society and politics lag behind economics. Footnote: this phenomenon has been repeated in contemporary backward or underdeveloped societies, though in a different sense. Not the unwillingness, but the inability of the central political authority, the state, to transform its social milieu, i.e. traditional society, in accordance with its economic and political ambitions. End footnote. Hence, on the one hand, industrialization, partial at least, hence on the other, no modernization. What made modernization possible, and eventually a culminated process in parts of Western Europe? This is the kind of historical question which Marx may have asked himself, and, in fact, Marx's search for an answer to it may be seen as the pervading theme of his work. This theme is relevant here because it concerned the very issue over which Trotsky's view of backward development diverged from Marx's view of development in general. If Trotsky sometimes confused industrialization with modernization, Marx in his turn often identified modernization and industrialization with capitalism. Sometimes in Marx's work, capitalism appears as the result of these processes, sometimes as these processes precipitant, or necessary and sufficient condition, but always inevitably linked. Yet it is clear that although historically, for certain countries, this may have been true, there is in fact no necessary relationship between the processes and capitalism. It is perfectly conceivable for a society to become industrialized and modernized without beginning or ending with capitalism, though Marx, of course, did not see it as the ultimate end. If in Marx's time there were no examples to sustain this, developments since Marx's time, ironically, in those very countries in particular where Marxism became the official ideology, have at least partly confirmed it. Footnote: this is of course precisely what Trotsky sought to predict, i.e. that a modern society could be created without going through the capitalist stage of development. End footnote. Yet Marx's observations, pertaining as Marx's observations did, to a certain point in history, were legitimate, though Marx's observations' projection upon the future may have been much less so. From Marx's historical perspective, Marx could hardly do otherwise than to link capitalism with industrial society, with progress and advancement in general. But that Marx linked capitalism and industrial society necessarily and inevitably arose, not from Marx's account of history, but his interpretation of it. That is, from the fundamental thesis which saw historical change as the function of a class society. Dividing society into classes, Marx attributed to these classes roles, each class being in turn the quote bearer of some form of economic organization or system. Thus, for Marx, classes were logically linked to certain social processes. Thus, Marx could not conceive of a separation of economic forms from certain changes, of classes from these economic forms and hence changes, of capitalism from advanced society. Thus, the importance of the bourgeoisie and, later, the proletariat. This was, of course, the very kernel of Marx's thought, what made Marx into a social theorist and not a chronicler of history, and what eventually also turned Marx into Marxism. But it was this also which made it possible for Marx to conceive of modern society without the capitalist phase. And Marx's interpretation of a particular period in Western history was certainly turned into a, quote, supra-historical axiom, end quote. The originality of Trotsky lay in the fact that Trotsky was able to break out of Marx's historical framework as well as out of Marx's European self-centeredness. Trotsky had, of course, the advantage of belonging to a different and later historical epoch, but this was the very reason why Trotsky refused, even if not in a fully declared way, to remain locked within Marx's suppositions. That is, he took the time element to be crucial, and history is continuously transforming the possibilities of the future. Thus, Trotsky abandoned fundamentally the link between modern society and capitalism, and Trotsky saw modern society as attainable without capitalism. This is also why Trotsky, more than other Russian Marxists, was able to make not only a distinction between industrial society and capitalism, but to question the very possibility of capitalism, in a sense beyond the merely industrial features actually developing in Russia. In fact, Trotsky claimed capitalism as such did not and could not come into being, and only a non-capitalist, partially industrialized society had been created. The crucial distinction, however, was still between an industrial and a modern society and how one could progress from the one to the other. The advantage of Marx's analysis was that it provided the propelling force, the agent of change, namely a class, the bourgeoisie. The weakness of Trotsky's analysis was that Trotsky's analysis was forced to blur the distinction between the one and the other, since it could not account for the transition. The importance of this distinction now becomes clear. To bring about the process of modernization, an agent of change, a social or political force is required. In the West, for its own historical reasons, this agent was a bourgeoisie, which saw in modernization, economic, social, and political, the predicate for the fulfillment of its position and aspirations in society. Thus, modernization was, in the West, a function of deeply rooted social interests. This did not mean, as Marx may have thought, that everywhere else this scenario would have to be repeated, that elsewhere too only the bourgeoisie could and would play this role of agent of social change. In a backward society, in the 20th century, the absence of a bourgeoisie obviously precluded the reenactment of Western history, but it did not preclude another social force from assuming a similar role. The most obvious alternative was the existing political authority itself, namely the state, backed by the state's own administrative elite. Yet in Russia, this alternative did not materialize. As Trotsky had argued, the state either could not or would not undertake the role. On the contrary, the Russian state stopped always short of going beyond industrialization. This was because the Russian state's interests were economic military, not economic social, as Trotsky stressed. The consequence was, to repeat, industrialization without modernization. But if there had been no modernization, how much had really changed in Russia? In effect, very little, only segments of the formal economic framework. And if this was so, then Trotsky's concept of quote, combined development, although in itself a brilliant heuristic generalization, must be seen to assume a quite different dimension. The concept of combined development correctly identified the dynamics of economic change, but it was an exaggeration as far as social and political change was concerned. Thus, insofar as the concept of combined development claimed to link industrial with other changes, the concept of combined development was largely a misrepresentation of reality. Again, it has to be emphasized that Trotsky was aware of the limits of the concept of combined development's applicability. Trotsky returned persistently to the manifold ways in which Russia lagged behind modern or advanced societies. Trotsky stressed again and again the restricted nature of overall social change in Russia. But equally, it is clear why at a certain point Trotsky had to leave the distinction between industrialization and modernization blurred and ambiguous. For Trotsky's purposes, modernization was essential, since without modernization, Trotsky could not claim that the actual character of Russian society, particularly the character of Russian society's social classes, had undergone radical change. Trotsky had to assume in particular that the Russian workers had become a social, not merely a wage-earning class, in the full Marxist sense, analogous to its counterpart in Western Europe. Trotsky had to assume that a new social and political culture, having a mass basis, had come into being. Modernization, as Trotsky recognized, was in fact a precondition for the kind of new advanced society which Trotsky was to envisage for Russia. If the modernizing process was not a fact, what chance was there for this new society? In this sense, the pessimism or cautious reservations of the more orthodox Russian Marxists, who, however, did not provide any real, immediate theoretical alternative, was better grounded in Russian reality than the optimism of Trotsky. The ambiguity subsumed under this optimism was in fact to occupy and plague Trotsky's thought in these and later years. In the next chapter, we shall see how the limits of, quote, combined development were even more conspicuous within the context of Trotsky's theory of revolution. And in subsequent chapters, we shall see the practical dilemmas as well, of which such elements were the roots. Nevertheless, Trotsky was right in one respect. The continued tension between the new economic institutions and the old social and political institutions, the disharmony between economics on the one hand and society and politics on the other, could not persist. Industrialization need not lead to modernization, but in that case, industrialization need not lead to modernization, but in that case, it itself could not be completed. Insofar as the Russian state was determined to build an industrial edifice, the Russian state was itself becoming committed to some form of modernization, as well as creating demands for modernization. It is possible, therefore, that at some point the state, however reluctantly, but in accordance with its own military economic needs, would assume the role of an agent of social change, and the attempts at reform, particularly in agriculture, during the decade or so which followed 1905, seemed to confirm this at least partly. If so, the possibility of gradual, even peaceful change did not appear to be ruled out. Trotsky, however, was convinced that this possibility did not in fact exist. To initiate the kind of changes which were required, the autocracy would in effect have to decree itself out of existence. Was this a reasonable prospect? Trotsky believed that it obviously was not. Trotsky was therefore convinced that these changes would be brought about by different forces, that the collapse, consequently, of the old regime and the old society had become imminent, that, To repeat, the quote, entire preceding social development had, made revolution inevitable, end quote. Trotsky. That's the end of this section. Thank you so much for listening.